Al-Kindi. Al-Kindi lived in 9th century Baghdad, during what historians now call the Islamic Golden Age. The Abbasid Caliphate was at its peak, and Baghdad had become the intellectual capital of the world. And yet, if you sat down to eat with Al-Kindi, you wouldn't find anything fancy on the table. Just tharid, bread soaked in broth, and some dates. Everyone around him was leaning into the luxury, and he just didn't. For him, a clear mind was worth more than a good meal.
Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi came a generation later, in the 10th century, right when the Islamic world was translating Greek philosophy into Arabic. Big ideas were circulating everywhere, and Al-Farabi was at the center of it. But if you looked at his plate, you'd never guess. He lived on barely anything. Some rice, some bread, whatever happened to be around. His whole world was ideas. Everything else, including food, was just background noise. Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina lived in the 11th century and was arguably the greatest encyclopedist of his time, writing on philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and more. So, of course, he actually thought about food. He believed your diet should match your body and your condition, not follow some rigid rulebook. His meals were probably Persian. Osh, fresh fruits, good bread, sometimes richer dishes too. He approached life without excess or guilt, allowing both nourishment and enjoyment to exist in balance. Al-Ghazali sits at the turn of the 11th into the 12th century, when Islamic civilization was quietly wrestling with deep tensions between reason and faith, and he lived that tension personally. And then one day, he simply couldn't continue. He lost his ability to speak, walked away from his prestigious post in Baghdad, and disappeared into years of wandering and Sufi seclusion. His meals became as stripped down as his life. Bread, soup, small portions. He believed that a full stomach and a clear soul rarely coexist, so he chose the soul.
Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd grew up in 12th century Al-Andalus, one of the most sophisticated corners of the medieval world, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews were exchanging ideas in the same cities. His food reflected that. Grains, vegetables, olive oil, couscous. Good food, but never excessive. He spent his life arguing for balance and the middle path, and his plate was no different.
As-Suhrawardi. Suhrawardi was also a 12th century figure. It was a time when the inner life was becoming just as important as the intellectual one across the Muslim world, and Suhrawardi belonged fully to that moment. He saw light as the foundation of all truth. His meals were basic. Bread, occasionally some meat. Food occupied a minimal place in his life compared to his philosophical focus. His life was short. At 36, he was executed, which tells you less about him and more about the world he was living in. He barely got started and still managed to leave something behind that centuries couldn't erase. Ibn Arabi. Ibn Arabi bridges the 12th and 13th centuries. Born in Spain, he traveled through North Africa, Arabia, Turkey, and settled in Damascus, all during a time of enormous disruption, with the Crusades ongoing and the Mongol invasions shaking the Islamic world. But he seemed almost untouched by the chaos. He practiced extreme simplicity in eating. Bread, water, dates. His hunger was directed entirely toward understanding existence and the divine. Next to that, a meal was almost irrelevant to him. Mulla Sadra. Mulla Sadra lived in 17th century Safavid Persia, when art, architecture, and philosophy were flourishing all around him. But he kept stepping away from it, retreating into small villages, away from the noise, just to think and write. His food was what you'd expect, simple Persian meals, bread, nothing more than necessary. His life was marked by quiet simplicity rather than dramatic asceticism. Just a quiet, deliberate life. And somehow, that quietness is where his deepest ideas came from.